So this is going to be another example of broken access control, and it makes use of, let's call it a feature referred to as security through obscurity, which is generally a bad idea in cybersecurity. We'll take a look at an example and we'll explain what this term means. We're going to be making use of this lab, Unprotected Admin Functionality with Unpredictable URL. The objective of the lab is to delete the user Carlos. Without further ado, let's fire up the lab. One of the starting points when testing web apps is what we can refer to as root enumeration. So we might make use of a web crawler, or we might make use of an iterative directory buster type tool, which runs through a word list looking for all of the available URLs or web routes available on the app. Even if we did that, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to find every single route. Some links may not be available from the main page, so the web crawler won't find them. And word lists are non-exhaustive. While they can be very large, they don't necessarily contain every possible URL or web route that an app might make use of. And there's an example of this in this particular lab. This is why technology or automated tools can't solve everything, and why it's always going to be a good idea to have a human look at the source code. So let's take a look at the page source, and we don't really need to scroll very far to see that there is some suspicious JavaScript on this page. So we have a conditional statement if is admin. In other words, this looks like JavaScript logic to be executed if the logged in user is an admin. Now this particular code won't do anything because we can see there is a declaration var is admin equals false. In other words, this JavaScript will never execute. It's obviously a relic. It was potentially used during development or production. Let's take a look at this code, and we can see it's creating a new element that is going to be added to the DOM. You can see it's named admin panel tag. We have document.createElementA. So this is going to be a hyperlink. We then have a href attribute set to that hyperlink. And here's the important part. We have a URL /admin VBOLL1. This is simply a random code of letters and numbers. The interesting thing in the context of the Burp Lab is it changes. If you refresh the lab, you're going to get a different admin URL. Let's take that admin URL. Let's copy it. Let's visit it and see what we find. So we find ourselves at the admin panel. No authentication was required to reach this stage. In other words, we have access to admin functions, but we are not authorized to use them. We're not authenticated as an administrator in this case. Now, there is a security mechanism in place here. The idea is if we make a URL complex enough, it's unlikely that anyone would ever guess it. Now, this is not an especially complex URL, but it's fairly unlikely that VBOL1 is going to be included in any kind of word list. So we're not going to find this with dirbuster. Because of the way that the link was included inside JavaScript, it's probably not going to be picked up by a web crawler. So automated scans are going to miss this URL. And if it wasn't included in the JavaScript that we've just looked at, it would be very unlikely we were going to guess this. This is especially true if we start adding additional length to the URL. Imagine the same URL, but an extra 50 random characters. It's fairly unlikely that anyone is ever going to guess that. So the idea here is that if the root becomes totally unguessable, it doesn't need to be protected by a password, or at least that's the idea that the developer has in this case. If we make a URL obscure enough, it then becomes secure because no one's ever going to guess it. Having said that, you can see the consequences if someone does figure out what this URL is. They have completely unfettered access to administrator functions. So this general concept of security through obscurity is not a recommended approach. It's certainly a good idea to have that as one layer of security. It's a great idea to have URLs that are not guessable and don't appear as part of word lists, but we still need to protect the administrator functionality with a username and password also. We don't want security through obscurity being our only layer of defense, especially when it's arguably not that obscure in this particular case, because there's only 6 characters after the dash That's something that could potentially be brute forced given enough time. So key takeaway here from a mitigation perspective is even if you have very unpredictable, obscure URLs, it's still important to have a second layer of access controls, perhaps in the form of a username and password. We clearly have access to administrative functions. Let's try deleting the user Carlos. You see there are no security controls from this point onwards. Ideally, there would be. Even after we send this HTTP delete user request, there should be something checking our token or our session ID to make sure we are a legitimate admin user. So this is another example of broken access control. It's simply too weak in this case. It's not obscure enough, and there's no second layer of protection for using administrative functions. All right, hope it was helpful. Thanks very much for watching.